Krásný den. My vás moc vítáme u dnešního rozhovoru. Já jsem Ripsi Zahrabian Mišáková, jsem terapeutka, průvodkyně rodinnými konstelacemi.
A já jsem Kristýna Strolená, jsem dula, terapeutka, laktační poradkyně.
My jsme společně vytvořili metodu dosycení a dneska jsme se pozvali Martu Sweezy, která je americká učitelka, vlastně profesorka na Harvardu, na fakultě medicíny a je to také terapeutka, psychoterapeutka, která používá systém interní rodinný systém rodinných vazeb a budeme se dneska povídat o tom, jak se ten IFS systém staví k traumatu, a co s ním pak vlastně, jak ho opečovává.
So, Marta, hello again. It's really nice to have you here. We would like to start with some introduction of internal family system, if you like. And what is it and how people can use it, how people can connect with themselves
via this method.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So internal family systems therapy was developed in the, I guess, 70s, 80s by a man named Richard Schwartz, who was living in Chicago at the time and is back there now. And he was a family systems therapist. And as he worked with, he was treating kids, young people, people who had a lot of trauma in their backgrounds. And he did a small study on young women with eating disorders. And he thought that his family therapy approach he was very confident that his family therapy approach would work and they would stop the eating disordered behaviors. And what he found was that he could help the families, he could help these kids and their families, and the families would do better and the parents would do better, but the kids would not stop their behaviors. They continued. And so he felt very discouraged and he just started listening to them. And they would talk about their parts. So what they meant was, I have one part who wants to binge, for example, and another part who becomes very critical and angry about the binging, and they get into a big fight, and I'm very overwhelmed by this. And it's as if they were watching two people in their head have a big quarrel. And listening to this, he said, well, can we talk to them? And it turned out the answer was yes. So his clients would begin to interact with these parts in their head, and the parts would talk back. And that was a big revelation. Like, what are you upset about? They would get curious about these parts, and the parts would explain their motives, which was tremendously useful. So the part who was binging wasn't irrational. It had a reason for doing what it was doing. And the other part who was critical and angry about that also had good reasons for being upset about this way of handling things. And so the client then could, with that curiosity and an increasing amount of compassion for these parts as she understood what was going on with them, could get in the middle of these quarrels and begin to negotiate solving the underlying problem. And the underlying problem invariably was that the person had been hurt at some point in their life when they were younger and had been, scared or caught in a bind, basically, in their family, or terrorized in some way, and that when they were most vulnerable as little kids, something really traumatizing for them had happened. And these parts were trying to manage those feelings and that information without having it overtake the person's life as they grew up. So the parts were just trying to make life bearable and help the person be functional in a dangerous world. But they were not playing with a full deck of cards, as I like to say. They were young also. And so they had these methods that worked in the moment very well. You know, for example, if you feel panicked and in despair, binge eating will change the subject, right? It'll definitely give you something else to think about. And it'll be both soothing and a compulsive behavior that really takes you out of that feeling state. So it worked really well, but then there were all these other consequences to handling feelings in that way, which the critical part would be watching and would say, you know, your teeth are going to fall out, your body is suffering, you can't do this, you know. And the critic would, meanwhile, have a very different approach, which would be, I'll just try and get you to improve. And I'm going to tell you that if you do this right, and if you only you would do that right, and if only you weren't so much like this, and if you would be more like that, then everything would be fine. So that the kid who was in a situation where something bad had happened to them was in a position where they were taking full responsibility for that bad thing and believing that if only they could change or be different, that bad thing wouldn't have happened, right? And that doesn't work either, right? That's a misunderstanding, understandable for children, but a misunderstanding of the way of what was actually happening to them. So the bad thing that happened, the injury, increasingly would become an identity internally. I am bad. A bad thing happened because I am bad. And then if I am bad, I have to navigate the world by hiding the fact that I'm bad, by making sure nobody else knows that, by building a kind of persona or avoiding. And in some way, I have to manage this very dangerous information about myself. So life becomes a process of navigating by a false chart, basically, and it's scary, and it's a great expenditure of energy, and that's what these symptoms are about. You know, when somebody comes into therapy in distress because they have a trauma history, a bad thing happened, and it can have been really bad, or it can have been something that other people wouldn't notice as much, but it meant tremendous amount to them about who they are. And then it morphed over into an identity problem and became traumatic in an ongoing way about how do I live? How do I function? How do I be in relationship if I am this bad person? Does that make sense? Yeah.
You mentioned something like middle part, if I understood. So,
yes. Right.
Is that some kind of name for this part, like true self, or something
Yes.
like line or?
Exactly. And that was the other discovery that Schwartz and his clients made as they went along, was that as the client could get into relationship with their parts, there was more of a sense of separation between these parts and the client who was that, right? And so people would say, these young women would say, well, that's me. That's who I really am. That's my self. And so Schwartz started referring to that with a capital S. That's not, that's not the mundane self, but that's some very different kind of presence that shows up when these parts separate and make a little room inside and start recognizing each other and recognizing who you are, right? And so there's this self in there who brings the curiosity and the compassion and has a kind of maturity and wisdom that these young parts don't have. So the self is able to reassure these parts that ultimately that, no, it's like the self has this bird's eye perspective. No, that wasn't you. That wasn't about you. That was about this person, and whatever was going on with them. It didn't really mean that you're bad, or that this feature of you, which was insulted and injured or made you vulnerable, is something that you need to get rid of. This part who, this part who is shy, or this part who is the opposite, who's very boisterous, and this part who expresses feelings strongly. There's nothing wrong with that part. That part is fine, even though it got attacked in that situation. You didn't cause that. And so these parts that were exiled and kept out of consciousness can return, and they're really young children often. And the client then loves them up and says, come back. There's nothing wrong with you. And then those feelings of despair and I have to be somebody else and not me calm down. And the protective parts who are trying to handle those feelings can also calm down. So you're trying to get to this underlying problem of feeling, I can't be me. How can I live in the world if I can't be me?
So is it somehow about integration of these parts, like to be in ideal way, like one whole part?
Personality.
No, it's not actually. And that's a great question, because former therapy approaches to what was once called multiple personality disorder and is now called dissociative identity disorder, would pathologize the idea that we have parts. It would say, no, that's an illness and that comes from being traumatized, right? And internal family system says the opposite, which is that we all have parts. This is perfectly normal. And folks who have been very traumatized have a very highly activated system. And sometimes the parts are very separated by dissociation, but it's normal to have parts. Everybody has this. And what you're trying to do is in principle just the same thing for anybody who walks in your door, which is help them get into relationship with their parts and make their life safer inside, so that you can navigate the world more as an adult and be safe, because you are playing with a full deck of cards.
Our method, we use Jungian or how it's in English, archetypes. Some of them, the inner child, the inner woman, inner man. And it helps people just to understand what's going on inside of them. And I guess the IFS is also, it opens the eyes, and person can say, wow, now I understand all my inner fights.
Exactly.
And then I think this is a moment of revealing it. I feel better, lighter, because now I'm like fine, perfectly fine. I'm not wrong. And
right.
You wrote a book about IFS and guilt and shame. And guilt and shame is something that is often people mentioning, like I feel guilty because it happens to me. Maybe I am the one who did it or asked for it, Let's say we talk about sexual abuses or physical or psychic, like all
emotional.
kind of all kinds of these abuses. how about this guilt? How you treat it?
Well, let me first differentiate shame and guilt, okay, because it's really important. They're not the same. They're both what are called self-conscious emotions. In other words, I'm looking at me critically in some way with both of these emotions. But guilt is about, I did wrong. I did some kind of behavior that was a transgression against somebody else. And I need to pay attention to that. And I am concerned about the person who is affected by my behavior. And I need to make a repair of that. So the action urge of guilt is to reconnect in the relationship and reweave those broken threads by reaching out and apologizing and owning the behavior and saying it wasn't right. It wasn't about you. I did that and I shouldn't have done it, right? So it's validating for the recipient of the transgression. It makes them whole again, basically. And then it allows a relationship maybe to continue if the other person wants it. But at least it makes them whole and emotionally. But shame is a global assessment of personal value. So if I feel ashamed for because something happened to me or because of how I behaved, my action urge is going to be to hide and to deny and to avoid or to get angry, right? And in that way of denying, no, that wasn't me, it's you, right? And you see this in couple therapy all the time because the global assessment of value is so devastating. I am, it's not I did, but I am bad. I am something unacceptable. And that's what this idea, this sort of way of looking at the mind as plural. We all have these lots of parts, and a part of me did this thing. It immediately takes away the global assessment. So it sort of de-shames people, makes if I misbehave, it makes it much more possible for me to look at myself and say, that's not all of me, and I can do better than that, and I am concerned about you. So it sort of makes guilt more possible and shame less likely, right? And not that but if somebody looks at me and says, you know, curly hair is really a terrible thing, right? And I'm 5 years old, you know, you're not like anybody else, you have curly hair, something is wrong with you. It's going to be very hard for me at 5 to grapple with that and say, well, actually, that's not true, right? Especially if I'm surrounded by people with straight hair, right? So I'm going to develop a belief that there is something wrong with me and carry that belief forward based on that incident. Oh, if only I could have straight hair, I would belong, everyone would love me, blah, 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 right? So, we get injured in these ways as we go along in life. And we're not even necessarily consciously aware that becomes a navigating system, that belief, for how we're willing to show up with people. I can't remember where we started with that though. What was the
I was asking about the guilt and shame, and you
guilt and shame, that's right. So
different.
that's a shame scenario, right? And so shame can either come from something I did or can come from how I'm treated, right? But guilt is the more appropriate behavior if I did something wrong, right? Now, on the other hand, guilt can be what I call maladaptive, right? It can be not deserved. So if, for example, a child grows up with depressed parents and then they become a teenager and they have spent their childhood taking care of their depressed parents. So they've been parentified and the roles have been reversed. And then they feel guilty about wanting to go off and have an independent life as they get older. That is not deserved guilt. In other words, there's nothing wrong developmentally. It's appropriate for that kid to grow up and go off and be independent and check things out in the world. And that they feel inhibited about doing that is maladaptive guilt. And so somebody comes in, and people come into therapy with this all the time, where they feel responsible for people who really they can't take care of. Actually, they can't fix their parents, and they're sacrificing themselves in some way that isn't actually appropriate developmentally for them or for the people they're involved with. So guilt is good, but it can also be maladaptive, right? And not useful in a certain situation. Whereas shame, the sense of I am shameful, is not useful for individuals, in my view, right? I mean, you'll see a lot of arguments in the literature of our field saying that shame is, people need to be able to feel shame, right? So it's a good thing if people can feel shame. We don't have to worry about that. We're all hardwired to feel shame. And actually, for the individual who feels shamed in a social situation, it's a very bad thing. It causes them to either avoid and withdraw, or eventually to become angry and to and have protective parts who are aggressive, sometimes in very hidden ways, right? So,
and if we are concrete, I don't know how in America, but here we often see parent or grandparents, especially with little children, and they say, shame on you, you are not a good girl because you don't want to borrow your toys.
Right, exactly.
What's going on inside of the child?
Yeah, so what happens then is the child absorbs that message, right? Oh, there is something wrong with the part of me that doesn't want to share the toys. You know, I have a selfish part. I have to do something about. I am now in charge of policing that selfish part of myself. Some other part, a protective part, comes along and says, well, if you're going to really belong and be loved, you better not be selfish anymore. You better sacrifice yourself and not feel these feelings, not know what you want in life, because other people, you're going to be stepping on other people's toes and they're not going to like you, right? And they learn to, the child who's been admonished in that way learns that the way to be loved is to sacrifice her or himself.
And does the child feel shame or guilt, or which one of these?
Well, they may feel both. I mean, so guilt is I did wrong. Shame is so I am bad, right? So a child who is told you are being selfish for not wanting to share your toy, has been told you have a behavior that's wrong. You did wrong, so you are bad, right? So the two are linked. The kid goes from one, I'm doing something bad, to the other. So this is about my identity. This is something bad about me, right? And but people can also come in with into therapy with a more shame-based picture or a more guilt-based picture. You know, if somebody comes in and talks more about feeling responsible for other people, and you see a pattern of self-sacrifice that doesn't seem healthy, then you're more in the guilt realm. Whereas if somebody comes in and says, I can't pursue this or that goal because I can't show up, or I would be, I'm too embarrassed, or, you know, they avoid things a lot, or they're rageful. That's more of a shame-based portrait.
So, can you see the connection between these feelings of shame and guilt, which we accept somewhere during childhood, and the sexual trauma? So when the victim feels like it's my fault and everything, so I was telling for it or something like that.
Right. I mean, often children are told that by a perpetrator, right? They're told by whoever's victimizing them to say, you caused me to behave this way. And so they're made very purposely to feel responsibility for the situation. And as soon as if they are not in a position to challenge that and understand that that's a reversal of reality, then they can definitely feel guilty. And they can also feel ashamed. I caused this person to behave in this way, and I am, and they would only behave that way because I'm a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
So there's both. I did wrong and I am bad.
It's also very common symptom or something that we meet often when women come to us with something like trauma during birth that they met with. So it's something like, okay, if I would be more prepared or could say more loudly something I don't like or something like that. So then what we can do, can we somehow connect with that part who feels the shame or something?
Well, yeah, let me give you my portrait basically of what I call the shame cycle, right? So that say somebody and you're talking about women giving birth and having a hard time giving birth, is that? Yeah. So if someone gives birth and things, it's a hard labor or something goes on, and somebody says to them, well, if only you'd gone to more exercise classes before this, you wouldn't have had such a long, hard labor. Next time, try to do better, right? And so she feels that she's being told that she could have done something else, and she is responsible for this basically completely uncontrollable experience, which is pregnancy, where things are happening to you all the time that you're not in control of. So where were we starting with this? What was your question?
What we can do, can we somehow connect with this?
And the shame, I was going to talk about the shame cycle, right? So she, let's say she also had some earlier experiences in life, which most of us do, that were scary or traumatic for her. And she had an internal critic that began to tell her at that time when she was younger, if only you were more this way or that way, these things wouldn't happen to you. So she's getting the same message again when she gives birth, that she could do things differently and therefore would have a different outcome rather than another scary thing happening to her. And so she's primed already to believe that she's responsible for things that she can't be responsible for. She has young parts who are going through life assuming that if only she could be different, then bad things wouldn't happen to her. And that's not true, but she's not aware that she's looking at her life and at the world through the eyes of a young part. So if she comes into therapy, we would want to explore that. Well, when this bad thing happened to you, giving birth, what did you assume about yourself? What did you hear in your head? And she begins to say, well, if only, or she might say it out front, you know, if only I were better at, more disciplined, and I had exercised more, this wouldn't have happened to me. The doctors told me that. It's clear that that's true. So it's me again. And then you say, what do you mean again? You know, well, I've always been like that. I never do the right thing, and things are always happening to me because I'm not responsible enough. So that's the doorway. Basically, we spot that and we say, okay, well, let's explore there. We're gonna check into your internal system, get you to turn your attention inside and hear who's saying that to you. Yeah, the doctor said it, but you already had a part saying that to you internally. You know, and so then you find the critic internally, and how do you feel toward that critical part? Well, I hate it. You know, it's always harassing me. It's hard for me to think straight. I always feel like I can't be confident about what I'm doing. All the effects of having, you know, a critic sitting on your shoulder and harassing you all the time. And so then you say, well, of course you have other parts who hate that. They feel, you know, it's mean to be treated that way all day long. So of course you feel that way. But could we get the parts who hate that to relax back for a minute and just, you know, go to a nice room, put some headphones on and do something else while you and I talk to the critic about why it does this job? Okay, you know, could you at least get curious about the critic, even though it's threatening? Well, yeah, okay, I think I can do that. So those other parts relax, the ones who are frightened by the critic. And then the person is able to be at least a little more curious. They don't have a lot of compassion for this part, but they can become interested. And the critic responds to this interest because it's in a tough job. This is another young part, and it wants to be heard, this part. So it'll say, so I'm guiding the client to just say, well, why do you do this job? What's important about doing this job? And then the critic actually starts doing its job. Usually it'll say, well, I do it because you're so stupid, and I have to do it because you never do things right. And so I'll say, well, hold up a sec. Let's ask this part not to do his job for a minute. I know it's really, really good at this job, and it does it a lot, does it automatically, but let's ask it to take a break from that just for a minute. We're not trying to control it or tell it, you know, what it can or can't do, but just instead of doing the job, talk to us about why it does the job. What is it worried would happen if it didn't behave this way? And then the part will say, well, if I didn't try to improve you, everybody would just walk all over you. No one would love you. I'm the one who keeps you acceptable and lovable as much as that's possible, right? Because, and so then we'll say, well, who do you think I am? Well, I think you're 6 years old. I think you're the kid who got, you know, criticized all the time when you were little or whatever. And I had to come in and step in and do something about that because you were being rejected all the time. I had to try and improve you. So the critic actually has a good motive. It means well. And it's copying behavior from people in the environment who were criticizing, and sometimes using their voice even internally. And but it's trying to make sure that this child survives, right? And because it's a protector. So those parts, it's a proactive protector. It's saying, if we can improve you, if we can make you lovable, you'll be safe in the world. And so then those parts are very tired usually, and they're very earnest. They mean well. They have no sense of irony, that shaming to prevent you from being shamed is not going to work, right? That it makes matters worse. And they need help desperately. So as the client hears about their good intentions, they go, oh, Oh, I see. And how old are you? You think I'm 6. How old are you? Well, I'm 8. I'm 8 years old. Oh, well, so I have an 8-year-old harassing a 6-year-old, and I'm trying to live my adult life with this going on in my head. That's not going to work. But I don't have to be angry with these parts. I can have a lot of compassion for them. And now that they're paying attention to me, I can actually begin to reassure them that that I can give them the bird's eye view, the adult view, which is it was never true that there was anything wrong with the 6-year-old, and she's fine, she's lovable, I love her, and you, the critic, we can do this a different way. So it begins to kind of calm these young parts down and help them to see alternatives and to trust that I, as an adult, have more resources than they did at the time, right? And often those parts are stuck in the past too, so we can get them out of the past, let them be children again, and the grown-up and some older parts can take over and navigate adult life, right? And on the other hand, there is usually not just this young part who got hurt, but there's often a reactive protector who was trying to balance out this critic who, with all that inhibition, who became disinhibited, right? So it might be an addiction. It might be, but it might just be, I watch TV at night too much. So all of us have this balancing act going on inside of us. And if there's too much inhibition and I work too many hours and I'm too hard on myself, I'm going to have some kind of release over on this side. I'm going to, even if it's secret from other people, and I don't tell anybody I'm doing it, I'm going to overeat on food I don't want, it's not good for me, or I'm going to watch TV all night and be exhausted the next day, or I'm going to drink, or I'm going to get involved with porn, or I'm going to, gamble, or I'm going to have some kind of release valve. And that's the reactive part who's trying to balance out this excessive inhibition, because you can't live that way. You got to have some relief. And these parts come in and they don't care about the consequences because they're just trying to handle the danger of too much inhibition in the moment. And the danger of too much inhibition ultimately is suicide. So it is a real, it's a real serious danger. So that's where, addictive processes come in.
It's just about the nervous system that is overloaded, right?
Yeah.
All the time is something going on inside of me, somehow outside, but I have no energy to see what's going on outside.
Yeah.
And I would just ask a question about the trauma. How do you explain trauma? Because is it possible that this situation I said before on the playground that is repeatedly happening, is it a trauma? Or how do you see it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, and I think this is, it's not to diminish the fact that there are some traumas that are more extreme, right? That's certainly the case. But by the same token, there are things, excuse me, there are things that are traumatic for children on the playground, in school, with siblings, with peers, that happen all the time, that are jockeying for power and control, and that involve shaming, right? That kids shame each other, adults shame children, adults shame each other in front of children. And it's all about that kind of behavior is about power and control. And I'm going to make myself feel better at your expense. I'm going to make myself feel bigger by making you feel smaller, because I'm internally having a process that's making me feel small, right? So it's kind of this is the shame cycle. There's an external event that makes me feel ashamed, I'm humiliated in some setting, then my internal critic gets going and keeps that idea going and that belief inside of me. And then I have a part who does it to somebody else in order to feel better about myself because I'm feeling pretty bad. And then I have a part who criticizes me for doing that. And again, and the cycle just keeps going, right? Inside, outside, inside, outside. It's an infinity cycle. And people get stuck in it and feel bad about themselves. I mean, nobody wants to be that person who becomes enraged and shames somebody else. It doesn't make for good relationships. It makes for a hard way of living. But these parts are not in our conscious control. We're not in charge of them. They're trying to protect us, and they'll do what they have to do that. So people come into therapy feeling out of control. Why do I do this? Why do I do that? And then if they're told, well, you would just take responsibility for your behavior, they feel more desperate because they don't know how. They cannot control these parts. The only way to influence extreme parts is to get in relationship with them and to help them with the underlying motive for their behavior. They're not going to stop unless they get that help. They're just trying to help out and make life safe. And anybody who challenges them they're gonna think, you don't understand. I can't stop. I have to do this. Right?
Yeah, from my own experience and experiences with clients, sometimes just simple thank you. I appreciate that you did this for me is
Exactly.
so enough. I was in a very hard situation a few years ago, and some part of me was constantly putting shame on the person who was involved in it.
Yeah.
And I was really tired from it because I would say my other parts were okay with this, but this just one part was constantly reminding what was happened, and this person hurt you, and you can't forgive him, and so on. And then I connected with this part, and she was really, really hurt too, because it feels like you just rejecting me all the time, and I was doing this hard job for you.
Exactly.
So simply,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. That's true.
Yeah.
You
That's
really
right.
did this hard time, this hard job, the hard
Exactly.
of it. And then
And nobody else was doing it. Nobody else was protecting me. Thank you for doing it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really, really important to see that part. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's just enough. Oh, you see me, really?
Yeah. Right. It builds a relationship, right? You develop a relationship with this part because it's never been thanked.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever said thanks for behaving badly. Oh, great.
in the opposite, I was like, come home, get away from here. I don't want to feel this,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We need to relieve these parts from their jobs so that there are alternatives and that you can handle dangerous situations in relationships without making matters worse, right? Because you have the skills to do that, but these parts don't. They're just little kids.
Because we have lots of moms listening to us. What can we do as moms if something traumatizing happens to our children? Child who is young, so he or she can go to the therapy and talk and understand.
Well, it's the same thing you're bringing to your young parts, right? You would bring to a child. First, you are curious, what happened to you? Oh, what was that like? What was the worst thing about it? How did you feel? So you're validating your experience is real. I see it. I know it happened to you. I believe you. I want to know what it was like for you. So that's all very connecting and validating. And then, eventually, depending on how bad the thing was, it can take longer, of course, if it was a real rupture in a very important relationship like sexual abuse or physical abuse. But bad things happen in school, some Tommy slugged me, well, that was scary on the playground. What was that like for you? And what did you want to do back when it happened? And what did you actually do? And how do you feel about yourself, given that you wanted to stand up for yourself, but you didn't because you were too scared? And now you have a part who's mad at you and telling you that you should have done things differently. Let's admit that you had reason to be scared and help that part to calm down and not blame you. So you want to coax parts who are gearing up to be critical internally to stop and know they don't have to do that. That this child is safe in relationship with you, even in a scary world, and that you're going to help them navigate that without being self-critical and believing that they have to change because the world is dangerous, right? That it's that, oh my God, I can't be me and be in this world, that causes this process to get going of self-inhibition, which has so many consequences down the road. So you do what, you validate, you're curious, you have compassion. If you think they could have handled things differently, you explore that with them. What are the options? What might you do? What would you suggest to yourself? What do I suggest? What do you kind of go over it in rehearsal? You can do all this with clients too. I go back to situations. If someone comes in, says, I wish I had done X, I'll say, well, let's go back there and help the parts who were reactive or non-reactive to unblend and separate, so that you can see how you would handle that from a place where you feel more confident and you have more of this bird's eye view that yourself brings to you. So rehearsing, or rehearsing future events if someone's nervous about something and thinks they can't handle it, so that people begin to get the practice. And the same is true with kids. You can do, kids love to play and rehash things in a theatrical way. So all those kinds of things. But the basic thing is the connection, the validation, the curiosity, and your feelings are fine and they make sense.
Patient.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
I have like a million questions, but I think this could be a really nice ending of this interview.
Thank you very much, Marta. Do you have anything
You're welcome.
to say?
Anything what?
Anything to say for the end of our interview?
Yes, I'll just say that I'm really glad you asked me to do this, because your population sounds like women in particular who you're helping out, and women who have had some hard experiences and who are bringing up children themselves. And often it's an opportunity as your kids hit certain ages, your parts internally are going to say, yeah, I'm 5'2" and I want attention. I don't want you just paying attention to that 5-year-old over there out there. Although sometimes they like to play with your kids, but sometimes they also get jealous and they go, I need attention. How about me? And it can be a hard time to pay attention to these things, but it's actually, because you're busy with life and you have a kid, but it's actually a great opportunity. These parts are coming up because they need your help, and they can use your help. And so if you notice them as your kids are growing up, you notice parts of yourself who identify with your kids because they're the same age and want attention, it's a good time to give them the attention because they'll feel better. This is not just paying attention in order to go over unbearable experiences again and again. It's paying attention in order to get those parts out of the unbearable experiences and help them feel better so that you get that sense of relief and lightness and release, and then you're more present with your children.
And the children see all of the mom, what's going on inside, they feel it. So
exactly.
and
Right.
it, right? The right way, I would say, the healthy way.
Exactly. You stop the intergenerational transmission of some of these beliefs, which your kids are hypersensitive to, will pick up. Oh, women aren't safe, or women can't be assertive, or women this or women that, the kids will absorb that. And so you can stop all that by helping your parts and feeling better yourself. So it's a win-win.
Perfect. I think it's often that women want to help the children and the husband and everybody else and just forget about themselves.
Right.
And it's important to say, we are the first person we need to get the attention to and heal ourselves, our feelings, our inner parts.
Yep. It's like that airplane metaphor, right? Get the mask, get the oxygen mask on you so that you can actually be present for other people.
Right. Martha, thank you very much. A perfect interview.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it and enjoyed meeting you. And good luck with your conference.
Thank you.
Tak. Teď jste slyšeli rozhovor s Martou Sweezy, harvardskou profesorkou a terapeutkou využívající Internal Family Systems přístup. A mohli jste v něm zaznamenat právě to, jak je důležité propojovat se sama se sebou, se všemi svými částmi a proč je pro nás samé, ale i pro ty, kdo jsou v našem okolí, zejména pro naše děti, důležité vnímat se, poznávat se a integrovat ty naše části, věnovat se vlastně sama sobě.
Hodně jsme tam mluvili o tom, že zůstáváme dětmi. My s Kristýnkou máme podobný přístup jako Marta, víc pracujeme s archetypy a vytvořili jsme konstelační vizualizaci, audio nahrávku sebeterapeutickou, která nás vrací k sobě, k tomu našemu vnitřnímu dítěti, k tomu zraněnému, které zůstalo v určitém věku, bez pozornosti, bez péče, bez dosycení. A tato nahrávka nám nebo vám umožní právě věnovat pozornost sobě, těm svým zraněným částem, dosytit je a tím poléčit a uzavřít, vlastně vytvořit zase o něco celistvější bytost a cítění sama sebe.
Protože právě to nedosycené, to nedopečované, nedoňuňané děťátko v nás, ty naše součásti dětské, se projevují v těch vztazích. Ať už s kýmkoliv. Jo. Mohou to být situace, kdy se nám rozbuší srdce v případě, že očekáváme konflikt, nebo ten konflikt nastane. Kdy
před sebou nějakou autoritu, že, které máme něco říct.
Jsou tam ty autority, ty naše hranice, to, že se za sebe postavíme, protože jsme třeba jako malé někdy slyšeli, že radši máme jako být sticha a držet krok. Jo.
Teď ostatní víc a lépe než my.
Přesně, poslouchej ty zkušenější, starší, poslouchej muže a podobně, tam jako toho může být spoustu. A jsou to situace mnohdy právě s těmi našimi nejbližšími a s těmi nejmilovanějšími, a tedy s dětmi. Protože prostě se s nimi strašně snadno dostáváme do těch situací, kdy jsme byli v podobném věku a kde to všechno často leží.
To bolavé si mnohdy žádá o pozornost. Můžeme předtím utíkat k práci, k sexu, k jídlu, k závislostem. Úplně jakýkoliv si představíte útěk, tak je to možné. můžeme zároveň se potlačovat, můžeme z toho mít zdravotní problémy. Takže pojďme společně, nebo každá sama za sebe, si tu nahrávku poslechnout, popracovat si s tím vším, co máme v sobě, vypustit ty emoce. A tím se uvolní nervová soustava a bude nám lehčej. A hlavně už nás to přestane bolet vlastně, jako to chování ostatních směrem k nám. A v konečném důsledku se tak mohou i přestat chovat najednou. Z ničeho nic. Může se to zdát jako zázrak, ale právě ostatní prostě reagují, cítí naše bolesti a reagují reaktivně na nás a my zase na ně a pořád si můžeme tak jako pinkat ten pomyslný míček bolesti. A my máme teďka v rukou tu možnost a tu moc, bych tak řekla, to změnit, vlastně uzdravit sebe, jít příkladem, inspirovat ty ostatní a zejména naše děti.
Můžete začít třeba hnedka dneska tím, že se zkusíte propojit s tou svojí částí, s tou svojí dětskou. Můžete si zkusit představit nějakou pro vás těžkou situaci, kdy jste emotivní, kdy máte pocit, že se potřebujete vyvstekat nebo naopak se schovat. Tak možná zkuste si vybavit takovou situaci, která se třeba nedávno stala. A zkuste se podívat, kdo vlastně na to reaguje, jaká vaše část vytváří tuhle reakci a volá si tak o tu pozornost.
My jsme vytvořili jak tu audio nahrávku, ale k ní máte i pracovní listy, které vám pomůžou, usnadní vlastně se dostat sama k sobě, do té situace, k tomu všemu, co tam hraje v ní roli. A pak vás provedeme našimi hlasy, vynikající hudbou, která je záměrově doplněná k tomu, abyste dostali prostor, aby ta vaše nervová soustava se mohla uvolnit, aby to podvědomí vlastně aktivovalo všechno to, co v něm je a co vlastně nás teda bolí. A velmi jemným, laskavým, dosycujícím způsobem vás provedeme takovou terapii. Bude vám potom lépe.
Můžete si to pouštět opakovaně, vracet se k tomu a vyživovat třeba všechny svoje dětské části, protože málo kdy je jenom jedna, která se ozývá. A s různým záměrem projdete různým průběhem, který se tak jako šije na míru. A to všechno se pak projeví takovou lehkostí v životě větší, hravostí, radostí a právě až jako někdy vymizením těch situací, které nás jako dostávají do těch úzkých a do těch silných emocí.
Často zareaguje i tělo tím, že přestaneme mít ty zdravotní potíže nebo se zjemní. Prostě těch výsledků, které naše sebeterapeutické nahrávky mají, je mnoho. Ženy je s námi sdílí, ať už ve skupině Prostor pro ženy Alchemilka, nebo je máme různě na sítích, na webu. Kdyby si měla k tomu jakýkoliv dotaz, tak piš, ptej se, rádi ti odpovíme, nasměrujeme. Každopádně to, co děláme, je funkční a máme výsledky spokojených žen, a co si myslím, že je důležité, protože potom vlastně je to vidět i v těch vztazích s dětmi nebo v vztazích s partnery zejména. A nás těší, že můžeme vlastně ukazovat tu cestu, jak člověk může dojít sám se sebou k nějakému smíření a přijetí.
Tak zároveň, kdybyste měli otázky na Martu nebo k tomu dnešnímu tématu, určitě nám pište a zase brzy na viděnou.
Ahoj.